Good evening, everyone. My name is Leandro Casa, and my groupmate is Lynn Tran, and I will be presenting the effects of CEO tenure and duality on CEO turnover. Here is a quick overview of what we will be covering in this presentation. We will first look at the research question and the surrounding literature, and design a hypothesis based on these factors. We will then look at our data results to assess our hypothesis. We will first look at our research questions. First, is CEO tenure and CEO chair duality associated with CEO turnover? And second, did the financial crisis of 2008 to 2009 have an effect on CEO turnover? Our principal motivation for looking into bank CEO turnover is because the banking industry has a large impact over the broader economy, and bank CEOs have an outsized influence with the management of banks in general. And bank CEOs, given their primacy within the management, also greatly influence how a bank navigates banking crises. Here is an overview of the banking industry. By the end of 2021, there were over 4,237 FDIC-insured banks. The banking industry is large, having a combined net income of $278 billion and assets of almost $24 trillion in 2021. The number of banks has been decreasing since the financial crisis of 2008 as well due to the mergers and acquisitions. This consolidation means that 40% of total bank assets are held by only 4 banks: Wells Fargo, Bank of America, JP Morgan Chase, and Citibank. The banking industry also recently suffered a few bank failures, and the last one to fail, First Republic, was notably sold to JP Morgan Chase. Now moving on to the bank CEO. As mentioned before, the CEO is the head of a bank's executive management. Often, the CEO serves as the chairman of the board. This brings up corporate governance issues since the board is directly responsible for evaluating and ultimately removing a CEO. The power a company CEO holds within a bank is difficult to measure, but can be reasonably concluded that longer tenure and being the chairman does imply greater CEO power. We will look into this in our analysis. There have been many research articles and papers done on bank CEOs. This is because bank CEOs have great influence and are the face of banks in especially times of financial crises. Here are a few points of research done on banking CEOs. Genter mentions that there are lower forced turnovers as CEO tenure increases. Forced here means getting fired. Fee concluded on their paper that CEO turnover of poorly performing banks is lower when there is CEO chair duality. And finally, Hayes concluded that CEO turnover from deregulation before 2008 is making banks more sensitive to stock performance. Here, then, are our hypotheses. First, increased CEO tenure is associated with lower likelihood of CEO turnover. Second, CEO chair duality is associated with lower likelihood of CEO turnover. And lastly, the financial crisis of 2008 and 2009 is associated with lower likelihood of CEO turnover. Our data came from bank holding company 10K and proxy statements from 2004 to 2021. In our sample, we had 683 different bank holding companies with overall filings of 6,820 within that period. The total number of observations is only 5,013 because some of the data had to be truncated because of missing bank and financial data. The table above gives the descriptive statistics of all bank CEOs within our data set. The average tenure for a CEO, for example, is almost 8.5 years, while the median is lower at 7, meaning that tenure skews to the right. And a high standard deviation indicates a more spread out tenure range. About 38% of CEOs are also chairman of their boards. The average CEO is 58 years old, 12% of them have an MBA, and 7% have a CPA. And only 3% of CEOs are female. The rest of the data can be gleaned at in this table. In Table 2, we created a logistic regression with turnover as our dependent variable. We can see that CEO tenure is a very significant variable in relation to turnover with a p-value of less than 0.01. And there is a negative relationship as well, meaning that CEOs with longer tenure are less likely to be replaced. There is also a negative relationship between duality and turnover, but the results are not significant, as can be seen with the asterisks. Then we look at only the years within the financial crises 2008 and 2009, as shown in column 2. The data above shows that financial crisis did not have a significant effect on CEO turnover, and neither did CEO tenure during the financial crisis. Before going over our conclusion, we would like to highlight the limitations of our data. First, corporate governance variables, which have an effect on CEO turnover, are not included. Also, regulatory changes over the years have not been looked into. In conclusion, hypothesis 1 is supported by our data, and an increase in CEO tenure is associated with lower CEO turnover. Hypothesis 2 and 3, however, are not supported, meaning that CEO chair duality and the financial crisis did not have a significant effect on CEO turnover. Here's our appendix for the variable definitions that we used for our data. And finally, here is the correlation table to make sure that there are no multicollinearity issues with the independent variables. There are a few variables we looked into with low correlation, such as CEO tenure and CEO duality, but most are very low. Thank you so much for listening to our presentation. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask.